You've seen wealth before. Private jets on Instagram, luxury penthouses with ocean views, watches worth more than most people's yearly income, $1,000 dinners plated like art. And because of that, most people think they know what being rich looks like. But let me ask you something. Have you ever actually seen how the richest people on earth live? Not influencers, not celebrities, not the people who want to look rich. I'm talking about the people who control serious wealth. The kind of wealth that doesn't just buy luxury. It buys distance, privacy, protection, influence, and in many cases, it buys the ability to disappear in plain sight. That's the part almost nobody sees, because the truth is, the richest people in the world don't usually live the way social media taught you to imagine. In fact, the more serious the wealth becomes, the less visible it often gets. And once you realize that, you start seeing something uncomfortable. Maybe what we call wealth online isn't wealth at all. Maybe it's just the performance of wealth. And the real version, that's happening somewhere far more hidden. Most people have been taught to recognize wealth through lifestyle. A bigger house, a nicer car, a better holiday, a more expensive version of normal life. And on the surface, that makes sense, because that's the version of success the world keeps feeding you. Whenever someone makes it, what do they show? A new car delivery, a luxury hotel suite, a penthouse tour, a shopping bag from a brand you can't pronounce properly, because those things are easy to understand. They're visual, they're immediate, they scream success without needing explanation. But here's the problem. That's not necessarily wealth. That's often just spending. And those two things are not the same, because if someone buys a 2 crore rupee car, what does that really prove? Only one thing, that they had 2 crore rupees available to spend. That's it. It doesn't tell you how the money was made, how long it'll last, whether it's growing, or what system is actually holding that lifestyle up. In other words, you're seeing the result without seeing the machinery behind it. It's like walking into a movie theater, staring at the screen, and assuming you understand the entire film industry. You see the image, but you don't see the camera. You don't see the production team. You don't see the financing. You don't see who really controls what gets made. And that's exactly how visible wealth works. Most people aren't looking at power, they're looking at the aesthetic of power, and that's a very dangerous thing to confuse, because if the visible layer is this polished, what exactly is hiding underneath it? This is where things start getting strange, because at a certain level, wealth stops looking personal. It stops looking like my house, my money, my company, my assets, and starts becoming something much harder to map. Let's keep it simple. Imagine 2 people. The first person owns a house. His name is directly on the paperwork. You can trace it. You can identify it. You can clearly connect the asset to the person. Simple. Now imagine someone else owns a house, but not in the normal way. The property sits under a legal entity. That entity is connected to another layer. That layer is governed through a separate structure. And somewhere above all of that, the real control sits quietly in the background. Now ask yourself, who actually owns the house? The answer becomes blurry. And that blur, that's not a glitch. That's the feature. Because once wealth becomes layered like that, it becomes harder to trace, harder to question, harder to challenge, and much harder to connect to one obvious person. And this is where most people completely misunderstand rich people. They assume wealth always wants to be seen, but serious wealth often wants to be separated. Not because it sounds impressive, because it's useful, because once the money, assets, and control points stop sitting directly under one visible identity, you stop looking like the center of the system. And the moment that happens, power becomes much harder to read from the outside. But if ownership becomes blurry, then where does the real control actually sit? That's where the game gets even more interesting. This is one of the biggest illusions people fall for, because most people assume if you own it, you control it. And if you don't visibly own much, you probably don't have much power. But in the real world, especially at higher levels, those two things can become completely separate. Think about a small local business. If you own the whole thing, you make the decisions. Easy. Now scale that up. A much larger business, more moving parts, more decision makers, more structures, more people involved. Suddenly, ownership alone doesn't explain who really has power anymore, because now the real question is not who has the biggest visible piece. It's who controls what happens next, who influences the direction, who shapes the decisions, who has the leverage when things move. That's the real layer most people never learn to see, because serious wealth is not always obsessed with owning everything. Sometimes it's obsessed with something much smarter, controlling outcomes. And once you understand that, you start noticing something very strange. A person may not appear to own that much directly, and yet somehow, the world around them still bends in their favor. That's not luck. That's structure. Think of it like this. You don't need to own the road if you control the traffic signals. And once control gets separated from ownership, power becomes much harder to locate, much harder to challenge, and much easier to underestimate. But even that still doesn't explain why this world feels so closed off. Because power alone doesn't keep people out. Something else does. And this is exactly where the illusion starts to break. Because once you stop looking at what rich people show and start looking at what they quietly control, the entire picture changes. Because most people believe something that sounds fair, but isn't actually true. They believe, if I just make enough money, I'll eventually enter the same world rich people live in. But that's not how the upper layers work, because many of the most valuable opportunities at that level are never public to begin with. They're not waiting online. They're not openly available. They're not sitting there for whoever works hard enough. They move quietly through private introductions, closed conversations, trusted circles, people who already know each other. And that changes everything, because if the best opportunities are private, then most people are not missing out because they weren't smart enough. They were excluded before the competition even began. That's the part most people never think about. The average person sees life like an open race. But at higher levels, a lot of the race happens before the public even knows the track exists. And if you're not inside that environment, you don't just lose. You stay invisible to the opportunity itself, which means the real advantage isn't always talent, or effort, or even ambition. Sometimes the real advantage is simply this: being in rooms most people will never even hear about. And once you see that clearly, the world starts looking a lot less merit-based than it first appeared. But there's still one final layer that explains why almost nobody sees this system clearly, and it might be the most important one of all. Because at the highest level, visibility is not always a flex. Sometimes it's a liability. Think about it. If someone openly showed how their wealth is structured, where the real control sits, how their systems are protected, how their influence actually works, what would happen? People would start asking better questions. Competitors would react. Institutions would notice. Pressure would build. The architecture would become easier to study. And powerful systems rarely benefit from unnecessary attention. They benefit from stability, from distance, from being difficult to fully decode. So instead of showing you the architecture, the world shows you the packaging. Luxury, status, success, aspirational lifestyle. The visible version of wealth that's easy to consume, easy to admire, and easy to chase. But not especially useful if your goal is to understand how serious money actually works. And that's the trap. Because if all you ever study is the visible layer, you can spend your entire life copying the look of wealth without ever touching the structure behind it. And once that clicks, you realize something important. The richest people don't just live differently. In many ways, they live inside a version of reality most people were never meant to fully see. So here's the truth. Most of the time, you are not looking at wealth in its real form. You're looking at the version of wealth that's safest to display and easiest to understand. The real version is quieter, more layered, more protected, more invisible than most people realize. And that raises a much darker question, because if serious wealth is hidden this carefully, then how is it protected so effectively? How does it survive? Lawsuits, market crashes, public scandals, even governments? Because in part 2, we're going deeper into how the rich protect their wealth and keep it untouchable. So if you want to understand how the system really works, subscribe now. If this video changed your perspective, like, comment your thoughts, and share it with someone who still thinks wealth is just luxury. See you in the next one.